Hello, I'm planning to walk the Camino de Santiago, and over the last couple of weeks I've been making some videos about my planning and preparation for it. So I thought now I've got to the stage where I need to get off my backside and actually do some walking. And on this walk I'm going to do everything that I plan to do when I'm walking the Camino, so it's sort of a test. So in my rucksack I've got everything I think that I'm going to need on the Camino. Tonight I'm going to stay in a hostel where you sleep in a dormitory, so I'll have to talk to people and be sociable, which will be interesting. And along the way I'm going to stop off at points of interest to try and make the walk a bit more interesting, which I plan to do in Spain as well. So, and also I've got an Ordnance Survey map, so I know where I'm going. So while I get on with the boring old walking, here's some information about the map that I'm using. This is an Ordnance Survey map, and when you're walking in Britain or on your holidays or just having a day out, it's full of really useful information. It has tourist information, visitor centres, walks, nature reserves, hostels, campsites, land features, electricity pylons, churches, steeples, churches, spires, 3 types of windmill, 3 types of wood, orchard, parks, land access, railways, tunnels and cuttings, viaducts and embankments, stations, principal and minor, heights, contour lines every 10 metres, 5 types of archaeological sites, marsh and saltings, canals, lighthouses used and disused, cliffs, high watermark, low watermark, dry canals, lakes, footbridge, weirs, tidal limits, ford, mud, shingle, beacon, long distance public access, boring old roads. But the most important ones when you're walking in the countryside are the public rights of way, footpaths, bridleways and byways. Every red dotted line on this map is a public footpath and a right of way. Britain is covered in a network of them, and there are over 140,000 miles of footpath in England and Wales alone, which means there are more miles than there are of road. And they're all carefully documented to make sure nothing mysterious happens to them and people carry on being able to access them. You can tell it's a proper map because it's got magnetic north, true north and grid north, and it even gives you a formula so you can allow for the constant changing of magnetic north. But you don't normally need a compass because the roads and landmarks are drawn so accurately, often you can tell where you are and which way you're facing just by looking at the map. And the maps have been accurate for far longer than there have been aircraft and satellites to have aerial photography. They started to draw them in the 1790s, and they did it through a mixture of triangulation from the tops of hills and mountains and measuring things with tape measures in great detail. For example, the distance from the road that houses were built. And they started in the 1790s, and it took them over 80 years to map the whole of the country. But when they'd finished, they'd done these fantastic maps. And in fact, before the maps were drawn by computer, they were drawn by hand, and it would take one person 2 years to draw a map of this size. So it really was a great endeavour. I've come into the village of Shere because I need to get some food, but villages are good places to come to anyway in Britain because they have churches like this one which are full of history, and they have pubs with good value for money food, and you don't have to drink alcohol, you can drink coffee or something like that, and they have a toilet, which is a good thing to do. And also this one has a museum, but the museum's closed today, so I won't be able to go and see that. I have found out one thing today though: when you're walking with a heavy backpack going down a steep slope, it's best to lean forward a bit to keep your centre of gravity above your feet. I had a bit of a slip, although I have now just checked out the first aid kit, which seemed to work okay, so that's lesson 1 for today. This is St James's Church, and it's over 900 years old, but it's famous for something that happened in 1329. 600 or 700 years ago, people really believed in God, and they believed if you didn't live your life properly, you were going to hell. So if you wanted to dedicate yourself to God and to live a religious life, you could become what they called an anchor, and that's a bit like being a hermit, but instead of going to live your life in a cave in the woods or somewhere like that, you would live your life in a cell that was built up against the side of the church. And that happened to a woman who lived in this village called Christine Carpenter, and she asked the bishop if she could be allowed to become an anchoress, and he agreed. So in 1329 she went into the cell, and the cell had a small opening into the church so she could see the church services and take part in the service, and it had a window with bars on it so as food could be passed in and other things could be passed out again. And the reason they needed the window was because it didn't have a door. As she would have gone into the cell, they would have walled it up behind her so there was no getting out again, and they would have read passages from the funeral service, because you were leaving this world and you were going to live a religious life, and then when you died you go to heaven, and that's when you would get your rewards. Well, it seems she may have changed her mind, because 3 years later it seems that somebody helped her to escape and freed her, and the bishop got to hear about this, and it's not clear from reading the history whether she asked the bishop if she could return and continue being an anchoress, or whether the bishop insisted, because she'd taken these vows to become an anchoress, whether he insisted she go back in. But anyway, 3 years later, he one way or another, he orders her to go back in, and it's a bit vague what happens to her after that, whether she does go back and lives the rest of her life in the cell, or whether she decided not to. But what's remarkable, people get very excited, think this church is 900 years old, but the documents dating back to 1329 still exist. The Church of England have kept hold of them and looked after them, so which I think is incredible. If you've ever tried to keep your paperwork straight for 700 years, you'll know what a great achievement that is. Also, lots of people became anchors or anchoresses, and some of them were quite wealthy. And if you're a wealthy person, you wouldn't be walled up in your cell by yourself, you'd be walled up together with your maid or your manservant. So that, if you can imagine what it would be like to be walled up with your boss for 24 hours a day for the rest of your life, that really is something. But if you think the church is old, well, if you go to the pub, then you're taking part in a much older tradition, because people have been brewing beer in Britain since the Bronze Age. The Romans brought with them tabernae, places where you go and drink, from which we get the word tavern. But the actual idea of a pub, in that it's like a public place of drinking in what effectively is a private house, that goes back to the Saxons. And the idea that when you go to a pub in Britain now, if you order a drink, it comes to you in a very certain measures, like a pint or half a pint, or I think it's 125 millilitres for a glass of wine. That is defined in law. And the idea that there's a law that says how much you should get served for your drink when you order one in a pub, that law goes back to 970 AD. So people have been drinking in pubs in pretty much the same way in Britain for over 1,000 years. And in fact, if you go to even a very modern pub, maybe one that's only 1 or 2 years old in Britain, when you go inside, the chances are it will be just like, well, the pub in this village in Shere, the White Horse, that the building's 600 years old, but the pub itself is only 400 years old. Well, if you go into a modern pub, it will be just the same. You won't be able to tell. Well, maybe you can, maybe it will feel like a modern copy, but the same style, and people like it, you know, with wooden beams and solid floors and plain solid tables. And I think that's partly because it's a practical design, which after 1,000 years people have decided that's the best design to have, and also it's just a nice comfortable place to go. So going to the pub is definitely one of the good things to do when you're on a walk in Britain. If watching this video you think to yourself, wouldn't it be lovely to live in Shere and a beautiful village, well, here's some information about houses in the area, and I think you might be in for a bit of a surprise. Here's a small modern 2-bedroom flat on the edge of the village. It costs £128,000. You're not getting the full village experience. If you want to live in the centre of the village in a character property, you might want to look at a house like this. It's still small, still only has 2 bedrooms. This one is built right up on the road and there's passing traffic, and on the day I visited there were vans parked outside, but it costs £585,000. Now if you had a 20% deposit, to be able to afford the mortgage we would need to earn £100,000, and most jobs that pay that amount are in London, and in fact a significant minority of people who live in Shere commute to London, which means they have to spend nearly 2 hours each way every day getting to work and back, and you need to do that for 25 years. Now by comparison, if you were to buy a similar price property in Guildford, which is also quite an expensive area, you could get a good size 4-bedroom modern house. So I know which one I would prefer, and maybe it's just better to sit in the graveyard and enjoying the sunshine and watching the world go by. "10 or 20 years ago, village shops in Britain weren't all that good. They were quite expensive and they were quite run down and didn't have a very good range. They tended to be independently owned. But in recent years, either they've gone out of business altogether because there wasn't enough trade to keep them going, or they've been taken over by the big supermarkets. And although they're very small, the shops, they have a much better range, it's better value for money, it feels much more modern. And so if you need to buy food in Britain when on your walk, a village shop, that's probably a good place to go. Well, I did say village shops are reasonable value for money, but I might be reviewing that opinion now, because this lot here cost me £10 and 14 pence. And normally in a week, my shopping bill will be about £30. So this is probably about twice, well, it's come to twice as much as it normally be, although things like the cheese, £2.50, that will last me more than a day. And I wouldn't normally have chocolate biscuits, but still, £10 a day is not too bad for all the food you might want to eat. Well, I've been lost twice today. The first time I found myself by looking at the Ordnance Survey map, and the second time I found myself by finding a car park with a "You Are Here" sign with a "You Are Here" sticker on it, but it had north at the bottom and south at the top. And even though I knew that, it did really funny things to my brain trying to work it out. But anyway, I think now I'm about 5 minutes away from the youth hostel, which is good because it's 7:45 and they close at 9, so it looks like I've made it just in time. Well, it's 9:30 on day 2. I was a bit late getting up, and everything takes a long time to pack up, which means I'm not organised enough. Tanner's Hatch is absolutely beautiful. It's an old cottage, and it's been refurbished, and everything is great. It's got all the latest services. You know, every bed has an electrical socket and a light. There was only one other person staying in the hostel, so I didn't really get the full Camino de Santiago feeling of camaraderie. And all we said to each other was all right and good night, and then he sneaked off about 6 o'clock in the morning, and I was too tired to even think about getting up then. So it's raining today, which looks like it's going to be waterproofs all day. And yesterday I did 18 miles, and today I feel surprisingly mobile. My feet start to feel a bit tender towards the end of the day yesterday. The author Bill Bryson once asked an American friend if he knew what to do if he found himself in a field full of cows, and his friend said, "Why would I find myself in a field full of cows?" Well, if you're walking in Britain, quite often you will be, because the rights of way go across farmland, and you can tell you're in a cow area because you tend to find the kissing gates or cattle grids or sties. And in fact, it's quite legal in Britain in some circumstances to keep bulls in a field where the public have got access to, and they can be quite dangerous. On average, there's about 5 people are killed each year in Britain by cows. Most of them are farm workers, but quite sometimes cows, if they have young calves, will attack people with dogs, because cows do not like dogs. And although a lot of people around the world are quite dismissive of British wildlife, partly because the British got rid of all of their dangerous and unpleasant animals like bears and wolves, while insisting everyone else keeps theirs for biodiversity reasons, there is wildlife. Here's a video of a fox that lives in my back garden, and I see him about once a week or so, and we say hello to each other. And in the local woods there are deer. But normally, if you see a documentary on television about deer, as soon as a deer sees a human, they're off, and the documentary makers, you know, they might be on the other side of the hill, and still the deer will detect them. But in Britain, the deer don't seem to mind, and if you can see here, there's some dogs in the background, and they don't seem to mind the deer, and the deer doesn't seem to mind them. So we do have wildlife, but it's all quite tame. Also in Britain, we have adders, which is a venomous snake. And although people in Australia don't take adders very seriously, it is a proper venomous snake. And just because no one's been killed by an adder in Britain for the last 20 years, it doesn't mean to say they're not trying. So there you are, the ferocious British cow and other wildlife. Well, I'm back. I walked up the hills and down the hills, and I walked in the sunshine and the rain. And if you're still watching this after nearly 21.5 minutes, well done you. So here are the things that I found out that I think will be useful when I walk the Camino de Santiago, and will hopefully be useful for other people as well. Number 1, make a list of everything that you want to take and use it to pack your bag. I think that will give you a lot of confidence when you set off on your trip that you haven't forgotten anything. And also try and have a test pack 1 or 2 weeks before, so that if there's any problems or you thought you had something but you turns out you didn't, you've still got time to sort it out. Whereas if you leave the packing to the night before, it might be a bit more difficult. So number 1, have a list and use it to pack your rucksack. Number 2, be organised and try to develop reliable habits. For example, always put the same thing in the same part of the rucksack so you can be sure you've got it. If you take something out of your rucksack, put it straight back again once you finish using it. Don't leave it on the ground. If you're using travel trousers that have got zips on the pockets, that's a good way to avoid losing things. But always put the same thing in the same pocket so you can just pack your trousers and you know you've got it. If one habit I've got into recently is to, whenever I stand up, I look back at the ground and make sure I haven't accidentally left anything behind. And I think for the first couple of days on the Camino, if I have a good effort at being organised and putting things back all the time, I think after that it will just become second nature, and the chances of losing things will become much less, and hopefully I won't have any problems. So number 2, be organised and try to develop reliable habits. Number 3, try to get to the hostel fairly early in the day. When I was staying in the hostel, there was me, there was one other guest, and there was the hostel manager, and we were all trying to share the kitchen. And in fact, the first time I went down in the evening to cook, I decided it was too busy, so I just went back up again. But the second time I decided I had to cook that time, and ended up sharing a cooker with somebody else. And it's just when you're sharing facilities, everything else takes longer. I think in the hostel they could have a maximum of 14 people staying there at a time, and there were 2 showers and 4 toilets. So again, you might think, I should now go and have a shower. If all the showers are busy, it's just another delay, and you think of all the things you have to do in the evening, you know, to wash your clothes, to cook, to rest, which is very important. All of these things take time, and if you're sharing facilities, it will take longer than you think. So the sooner you get to the hostel, the more time you have to do your chores in the evening. Also, the less chances there are that the hostel will have become full and you have to walk on to the next one. And also, on my 2-day test walk, I was a bit late arriving because I got a bit lost, and the pressure's on and you're walking more quickly than you would have wanted to otherwise. So I think there are lots of advantages to getting to the hostel in good time and giving yourself plenty of time in the evening. So what's that? Number 3, get to the hostel early. Number 4, visiting places of interest. I think that's definitely something worth doing, and this guidebook recommends somewhere almost every day where you could go and visit, like a monastery or a church or something like that. But again, be aware of the time, because you don't want to get to the hostel too late in the day. So number 4, visiting places of interest. Number 5, doing a test walk. After weeks of researching things online and thinking about what will happen when I walk the Camino, it was great to put it all into practice, and you know, to test your boots out and rucksack and waterproofs and staying in a hostel and the distances and the weight I was carrying. Until now it's been theoretical. Now it's suddenly become very practical and very real, and it's given me a lot of confidence and encouragement. So that's something I think everyone should do, and I think there's a real benefit to doing it. Number 6, talking to people. The Camino is quite well known for the friendships that develop and the camaraderie between the pilgrims. And I thought, well, walking in rainy old southern Britain where no one ever talks to anyone, and staying in a hostel where there was only one other guest, I thought, well, that I won't really talk to anyone and I will not get that same experience. But I found I was talking to more people much more often than I normally do. I don't know whether it's a physical thing, whether it's the endorphins and the adrenaline do something to you, or whether it's just that, you know, you're walking on your own and there's some human contact, so you just talk to people naturally more. But I found it does happen, you do talk to people more without forcing it or anything. And in fact, when I finished the walk and got on the train, I sat down and looked round expecting people to talk to me or to ask me questions about what I was doing. But of course, on a train, everyone looks down at their mobile phone and avoids eye contact at all costs. And it's quite a stark difference between the outdoor walking life in your waterproofs and all weathers, and suddenly you go into the train and you're back into the normal world where people don't talk to each other or make eye contact, and it's quite a noticeable difference. So number 6, talking to people is very likely to happen on the Camino, and that's something I understand much better now. Well, we're 27 minutes into the video now, so I don't think anyone will still be watching, but just in case you are, here are 3 more things for completeness which are really most appropriate to me. Number 1, in video 8 of this series I'm doing on walking the Camino de Santiago, I did washing and drying clothes, and when I did that in the hostel I found it quite difficult to dry my clothes with the travel towel that I had and also dry myself. So I've ordered another travel towel, a much bigger one, and also I'm going to take with me a length of string and some safety pins that other people recommend, so you can make a washing line. So I think that's one area of my plans that still needs a bit of practice. My boots and waterproofs and rucksack all worked fine, but when I did the test walk I used the outside pockets for carrying water bottles. Well, those outside pockets are really useful to put things that you want to have access to during the walk without wanting to open the pack up. So I'm going to order the proper Osprey hydration pack, and I get the 2-litre one so it's not too heavy, and then I'll be free to use those pockets for other things. I think that would be very useful. So if you are still watching, thank you very much, but I think that's everything, so goodbye.